So backed by popular demand, Susanna and I presented on this actually in the very first week of the NTI schedule. And so we've actually updated and re-looked at how we're using some interdisciplinary choice boards because they've been so popular throughout the district. So here's our question: how can I use questions to build interdisciplinary choice boards? So where we began before is looking at making sure that a choice board isn't just a random assortment of what students might be engaged in, that we can actually provide through questioning a way of structuring using those choice boards. So here we have in the middle of this a compelling question that's going to bind all of the other contents together. Right, that we're using a compelling question as like a gigantic umbrella that allows for all these different disciplines to live. So we're gonna go through then how this compelling question does that, and then how each of the different standards, each of the different contents can actually be represented by what are known as supporting questions that will help them build up student knowledge, agency, and so on towards being able to answer the compelling question. Before we get into how to go about building that and what that might look like as a conceptual model, we wanted to first sort of pause and take a look at what do we mean by compelling and supporting questions. So oftentimes we have the situation, which is very apropos to where we are now, which is where are our students and where do we want them to go? And that questions provide an opportunity to essentially close or open, either way you want to look at it, curiosity gaps. And then oftentimes, in order to get our students invested in the learning process, we have to manufacture some of these curiosity gaps. And one of the best ways of doing that is with compelling questions. We actually I presented about a week's worth on compelling and supporting questions and how those can be used to frame and focus learning. And part of this is lifted from that presentation. So compelling questions do two things simultaneously. So they're not just ornamental. These compelling questions are meaningful, right, as they need to be. The first part here is that compelling questions make space for the learner. They also then make space for the content. And that it's between this balance that we're trying to really hit when it comes to developing quality, compelling questions. So here's my daughter who can use her lived experiences, the things that she has interacted with, right, the so-called windows and mirrors of things, right, to better access a compelling question, right? So it has to be written with her learning in mind. Simultaneously, we're trying to combine, right, because it's interdisciplinary, all the different disciplines and how they might be brought together, right, to make sense of something. And that a compelling question provides an opportunity both to make space for the learner and also make space for all of the contents. So if compelling questions create gaps that challenge students' assumptions and spark the need and desire to make sense of the world as it relates to them, disciplines are lenses that complicate the world, right? So it's a way of sort of being able to see things from multiple perspectives, because that's what the disciplines provide, are vocabulary and skills germane to those disciplines. The goal of education is not to simplify the complex, but to make the complex accessible. Compelling questions help do this. So if we have our compelling question generator and we throw in, right, the different disciplines, we churn that thing up, out pops the opportunity to use compelling questions both in an intradiscipline, right? So if you're here and saying, oh, well, how would I use these questions inside of chemistry? We've actually got a teacher at Central High School who did that. Or it could be interdisciplinary, right, as that we're looking at today. So compelling questions are intellectually rigorous. They are student-friendly, right? They are also motivating, again, trying to create and manufacture some of those curiosity gaps. So some of the questions that are my favorite and compelling question is, what makes a community healthy? You could answer that from an art perspective or from an ELA perspective, from a science perspective, right? How does where you live affect how you live? Again, you can see this from multiple perspectives. We use compelling questions to frame units or frame, in this case, choice boards. And it's the compelling questions job to get students ready, right? And that question is answered by summative performance tasks, right? So that, again, these questions are not just ornamental, but if a compelling question begins the thinking, the summative performance task closes that thinking, right? It's the answer to that, right? So again, we're not just investigating questions for those questions' sake, we are actually doing something with them. The supporting questions, on the other hand, are much more specific to the disciplines, much more specific to the standards. They are the knowns inside of a discipline, the hows, the whos, the whats, and so on, right? And that just as compelling questions are bookended by summative performance tasks, so too are supporting questions bookended by formative performance tasks. And these are going to frame individual lessons, or in our case, those smaller sections on the choice board. So that compelling and supporting questions are, they work together. You can't have one without the other, right? Compelling questions provide a larger meaning, right, to the learner, and the supporting questions imbue that learner with the skills germane to that discipline. So these things work in tandem. What good is the top of the stool without its legs? So the compelling question would be the stool, the legs are the supporting question. And what good is a roof without the walls that hold it up? So how do I make then a quality compelling question? Again, we can talk about that, and there's another channel that we probably need to link into this part. But notice here we put quality compelling question. You should note that a good compelling question is subjective to the learner, right? So we're trying to look at what is a good compelling question that would be hitting those characteristics that we discussed earlier. The first one is to make sure that you meet the criteria of what makes a great question, right? And those are what we mentioned earlier, right? Kid-friendly, motivational, right? And intellectually rigorous. It's also recommended that you stress test, right, the compelling question with possible responses if you're using these interdisciplinary. So if you have a question like, how does where you live affect how you live? Well, what would that look like for science? What would that look like for PE? What would that look like for all the different disciplines that you might explore? You then want to create a summative performance task that helps align to that compelling question. That means then that as soon as you have a compelling question, you immediately have the assessment, right? For us, we're going to show you some examples here that we've used actually the Fraser History Museum that's developed the Corona capsule that is cataloging all the types of experiences that students are having during this time. They could also be backpack artifacts, they could be essays or videos, which the last two there are more traditional. Once you've done this, now you can start to create discipline-specific supporting questions that are also aligned to the compelling questions. So these supporting questions give some insight, some understanding, right? Larger compelling question. And once you've done that, to book in those supporting questions, we create formative performance tasks that are aligned to those supporting questions that also help students complete the summative performance task. So just as compelling questions need supporting questions, summative performance tasks need formative performance tasks. So I'm going to turn this over to Suzanne, who's going to walk us through some of the proof of concepts of how these might work for elementary, middle, and high.
Good afternoon. When Ryan and I first presented this digital learning opportunity, we had fleshed out the high school proof of concept choice board around a compelling question. And then afterward, we got a lot of questions around, do you have a model for middle? Do you have a model for elementary? And so we really wanted to sort of proof this concept vertically and sort of flesh it out and engage in the process of this planning ourselves in CDLI. So here you can see the elementary choice board for third grade. And what you'll see on both the elementary and middle is that you have the same compelling question and the same summative performance task as in the high school. And so what you have is this connection to community, the Fraser History Museum, the relevance to, of course, our time, and then this sort of overarching compelling question that really engages kids K-12. But what you'll notice are the supporting questions are very specific, as Ryan said, to discipline. And what you should see, and what we very intentionally did, is that the tasks and questions not only scaffold or feed into the compelling question in terms of processes, skills, and topics, but also they scaffold vertically. So what you'll see here, if you were to try to pull out some of the math tasks or the music tasks or the science task or ELA, what you would see is this vertical articulation. An 8th grade student probably shouldn't be being asked to do the same thing as a 3rd grade student, right? And so what we've tried to do here is really show how the tasks, standards, performances, how they should grow in complexity over time and how they should feed into the middle. And so if you'll go to the next slide, Ryan, thank you. This is our middle school example. And so what you can see here from the elementary, for example, math task where students are looking at a map and they have a little T-chart there with some data. And then if you look down in the very middle bottom task, how does disease affect access to supplies? Here we have a supporting question that clearly feeds that compelling question in the middle. And then what you see is 2 sort of sub-questions, task-oriented sub-questions. How long will my toilet paper last? And how long can I go without getting groceries? And so in the 8th grade, we know that students are learning more about functions. And so what both of these tasks represent is the application piece of rigor in the mathematics classroom. And then another piece I wanted to call out about this middle school sample choice board that we'll get to, that will kind of be made more clear here soon, is that we're starting to see up in the left-hand corner and then in the bottom right, you have an ELA and a social studies task respectively. And so what you're seeing here is that these 2 boxes are beginning to be connected. So in our ELA task, students are learning about the 1918 influenza pandemic. They're reading some things on the CDC. They're reading some stories of Kentuckians who lived through that. And then they're journaling or doing a video blog about their own experiences. And then they're interviewing someone else and then doing some contrast about how our lives are changing in this time. And then if you look at the social studies tasks down on the right-hand side, you have 3 sources that are external, that are articles. And then source D is actually the student's experience as referenced up in this ELA task. So our ELA performance, the work that we're doing, the thinking that we're doing in ELA, is providing the sourcing for source D in social studies. And so you can see how now in this iteration 2.0, we're starting to see those supporting questions come together a bit more. And so I'm really excited about the work that our team did here, deeper learning resource teachers, our content leads and coaches, because I really think this fleshes out this concept and it shows how each task feeds that compelling question and how we can see this vertical articulation beginning to emerge.
Suzanne, can I add real quick that one thing that we did is you'll notice some hashtags, right? Because there's sometimes about a choice board and there's some indication about what if they don't cover all the different things. Do you want to talk a little bit about the hashtags that we have here?
Yes. And so the way that these are designed, we know that students need to have choice in choice boards. We don't want to be assigning the entire choice board to students. That defeats the purpose of the student agency piece. And so we sort of developed a system where the hashtags are sort of the must-dos and those that aren't hashtagged are the can-dos. And so if we were planning on an interdisciplinary team in a middle school or in an elementary school, we know those sort of non-negotiable standards, those non-negotiable skills that we really want to see student performance on. And so we might require those tasks, but then the others would be optional. And so we may say you have to do all of the required and 2 of the optional. And then, of course, all of these tasks then would come together for that summative submission to the Fraser that answers that question, how can disease change the world? And students could call on both their required tasks and their optional tasks in that reflective or summative piece. And then this is the high school example that Ryan and I had previously refined for this presentation. And I think the interesting thing is here, we worked on this high school example, we fleshed it out, it was ready to go. And then just very naturally, we even engaged as our CDLI department in this work in backward planning. We went from the highest level, high school, right? We had the compelling question and we planned backwards. And so having this sort of highest level of performance, you can clearly see this sort of backward plan all the way down to the third grade. And so hopefully these offer folks just a proof of concept in how these pieces fit together. And I think as teams begin to use these to support their own work, what they should really be thinking about is, what is the sort of bundle of standards? What is the relationship between the compelling question, the supporting question? How does the task in performance show mastery of those standards? And then how do those pieces fit together and interrelate? And then it just sort of becomes a puzzle. So I know when Ryan and I were working on this high school one, we got a couple pieces in place. Our team wrote, we refined, and then we were able to fill in these puzzle pieces. And the further you got into it, the more quickly it came together. So hopefully these are useful for teams as they begin planning around interdisciplinary compelling questions in their own schools. And so this graphic kind of shows the thinking that we were doing. This is kind of offers a framework for interdisciplinary planning. And our hope is that this framework can kind of become a core of the conceptual understanding of interdisciplinary planning. And then as we move into next year and we begin to do more and more interdisciplinary planning across and within our levels, that we could build this out. So you see at the top the compelling question, each supporting question sort of siloed there by discipline, which is what you see in that high school example. We know that those lessons and the formative tasks have to stem from those supporting questions and then lead to those performances from the choice boards that answer the compelling question. And we know that the success criteria and models and feedback need to happen all throughout that model. And so I think in the middle school example, what you started to see is how the social studies and the ELA question up in the left-hand top and the bottom right, how they're kind of beginning to talk to each other. And so then if we go back to the model in the next slide, you can kind of see how, oh, look, could a single supporting question be over multiple disciplines, right? And so then here we're building coherence for students. So we have this common compelling question. We have the supporting question that might be interdisciplinary with multiple tasks and lessons underneath it. And then the same thing where students have these performance tasks that are then answering the compelling question, and they have a summative performance that's showing their sort of complete cumulative understanding of all of those standards and big ideas that they've been engaged in. And so our hope is that this kind of thinking where questions really are the conduit for interdisciplinary planning, that this little core can be built out. And of course, soon we would begin you'd see a box or some kind of layer on here around standards. You might see the CTE or pathway component, right? And so, but if we can use questions as an entry point for interdisciplinary planning, then that kind of can help bring us to the table. Sometimes our standards don't talk to each other and they weren't designed to in some ways. But if we can come together around these relevant big ideas, these compelling questions that kids care about, then it gives all disciplines an entry point and it creates a more coherent experience for students.
Well said. And just so you guys know, we've linked in. If you click on the choice boards, these here, they're actually linked in. They're all in actually the same document. So you'll be able to see those there if you want to see them a little bit more up close. Sometimes it's hard to see on these presentations. So we're going to end today by saying that there's different ways that you might do this. So these are just examples of how you might schedule this. Susan and I put this together where, once again, you're seeing the hashtags being used as these might be the ones that you're definitely going to use, right? And the other ones are more optional, right? And so this is just a way of pacing this out for students. And you might share something like this with them to help them pace through their day. You'll notice that on Friday, that there's not much, right? That there's an overlap, and it's because Friday would be really about pulling together all of what they've learned to be able to answer that sum and performance task as it relates to the compelling question. Another example of this that's more structured, right? Where you're sort of giving, as my kids have, right, from Bowen Elementary, they've got things each day they want to do. So this is just a different way of looking at it, where you're really allowing the kids to see what kind of questions do I need to investigate. And this is something that I really encourage, is that I used to say to my kids, what did you learn in school? Now I say, what questions did you investigate in that day? And that actually makes space for me as a parent to enter into the conversations where the kids are also experts in what they've been looking at. So that's pretty much our overall understanding of this. And if you guys have any questions or comments, or you want us to look at some of these choice boards that you guys have been looking at, we're happy to do so. A big shout out to J-Town Elementary and Shelley, and also at Carrick Elementary with Carrie, that they both reached out and sort of said, hey, can we take a look at this? And they did a great job of sort of just taking baby steps in this process, right? Where the first was just trying to get a choice board built, then trying to use a compelling question, then using a supporting question, and then working on the tasks. So you don't have to create all of these overnight, that there is an evolution as you move through this. So thank you guys very much.
Yes, thank you. And I also wanted to, I know Ryan brought up the intradisciplinary piece, and a school teacher that has done an excellent job with that is a chemistry teacher, Caleb Johnson, at Central High School. And so he created leveled chemistry choice boards that both show mastery of comprehensive sort of chemistry work, but that also are preparing his students who are going on to advanced placement chemistry. There's tasks scaffolded for them on there, and there are hashtags that show them which tasks they should do, and they're around a compelling question having to do with waste management or water. And then each task is intradisciplinary in that it gets at some of the NGSS standards and practices. They connect even to other disciplines, and he has had great student feedback. 85% of students there say that this is engaging, that they like the work, the quality of the work has gone up. And so just a shout out to a high school teacher who's really walking the walk there at Central High School. And we so appreciate him taking our very small little idea and running with it and making it great for kids. So don't hesitate to reach out to CDLI. We're always happy to support you, and we love seeing this great work happen for kids and families.